Frank Lawson was the kind of trucker who could measure his life in miles instead of years. 67 years old, gray beard like steel wool, skin weathered from decades of desert sun and dashboard glare. His rig, an old Peterbilt named Grace, had been his companion longer than most humans had. He hauled whatever the brokers paid best for. Mostly produce these days, sometimes furniture, once even live chickens that made the cab smell like a barn for a month. He didn't mind the loneliness. The hum of the diesel was his lullaby, the yellow lines his only prayer beads. But lately, that hum had felt hollow. His wife, Ruth, had passed away 3 winters ago, and since then, the road didn't sing the same. She used to ride shotgun sometimes, knitting or humming hymns while he drove. Now, her rosary hung from the mirror, swinging slightly every time he hit a bump. It was a Tuesday night in Arizona, somewhere between nowhere and Yuma. The radio was spitting static, and Frank's eyelids were getting heavy. He pulled off to a rest stop that looked half abandoned. One flickering lamp, a couple of vending machines, and a sign that said, "No overnight parking," a rule truckers ignored as much as speed limits. He parked, killed the engine, and rubbed his eyes. That's when he saw her. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a woman standing by the roadside, her figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. She wore a blue shawl that fluttered gently in the wind, and her hair glowed faintly gold. Frank frowned, rolling down the window. "You lost, ma'am," he called out. She turned to him, smiling softly. "I need a ride," she said, her voice calm, almost like music. Frank hesitated. He'd picked up hitchhikers before, but something about this woman. There was no fear, no worry, not even the usual backpack or suitcase. Just her, and that blue shawl. "Well," he said after a pause, "I'm heading west. You can ride as far as you need." She nodded, and he opened the passenger door. When she climbed in, the cab filled with a faint scent of roses. Odd, since the last load had been onions. "You can call me Mary," she said gently. He chuckled, shifting the truck into gear. "Mary, huh? My wife's name was Ruth. Biblical names. Guess I got a thing for him." She smiled again, that same calm glow about her. Ruth was a faithful woman. Frank's hands froze on the steering wheel. "You knew her." "I know many who are faithful," she said simply. He drove in silence for a while, the road stretching endlessly ahead. Normally, he'd fill the cab with small talk, but her presence made the silence feel full, peaceful, even. After a few miles, she spoke again. "You've been praying for something." Frank chuckled softly. "Lady, I barely remember how. Used to pray every day when Ruth was sick, but—" his voice cracked. "Didn't seem to do much good." "Prayer isn't always about getting what you ask for," she said. "Sometimes it's about being reminded you're not alone." Her words stung, in a comforting sort of way. He wanted to argue, but something in her tone stopped him. "You drive alone, but you're never really alone," she continued. He cleared his throat. "You talk like a preacher." She turned her gaze to the windshield, her reflection faint in the glass. "Maybe I am." They drove through the desert night, the stars sharp as glass. The conversation drifted between silence and small words, about the road, about Ruth, about how tired he was of hauling the same old loads for the same small pay. "You carry heavy things," Mary said softly, her eyes still on the horizon. "Not just in your truck." Frank sighed. "You've got that right." When they reached a fork near an old mission town, she asked him to stop. "This is where I must go," she said. He looked around. There was nothing, no house, no lights, just cacti and sand. "You sure?" She nodded. "You've done a kindness tonight, Frank. The road ahead will change for you. Watch closely." Before he could reply, she stepped down from the cab. For a moment, her figure shimmered in the headlights, like she was wrapped in light itself. Then she turned, and walked toward the darkness until the night swallowed her whole. Frank sat there, stunned, engine idling. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and got out to look. Nothing. No footprints, no movement. Just desert. He laughed nervously. "Guess I'm finally losing it," he muttered. "Too many miles, not enough sleep." But when he climbed back in, something had changed. Her scent lingered, faint but real. And on the seat where she had sat was a small white flower, A lily, fresh and perfect, though he hadn't seen her carry any. He stared at it for a long time before setting it gently on the dashboard, next to Ruth's rosary. Then he shifted into gear and rolled back onto the road, feeling, for the first time in years, that someone was riding with him again. The next morning, Frank woke in the cab at a diner parking lot. Sunlight poured through the windshield, glinting off the rosary beads. He blinked, remembering the night before. The woman. The blue shawl. The flower. He picked it up. Still fresh. No wilt, no bruise. Impossible. He shook his head and laughed quietly. Well, Mary, whoever you were, you sure left an impression. He walked into the diner for breakfast. Eggs, bacon, coffee black as diesel. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked at him twice. "Sir, you okay?" she asked. "You're glowing. Glowing." He frowned. She nodded. "Like you just saw something holy." He chuckled. "Maybe I did." They talked for a bit, and Frank told her about the woman on the road. When he finished, she looked stunned. "Wait," she said. "You picked up a woman in blue? Around Route 85. "Yeah. Why?" Her hand trembled. "You're the third driver this year to say that. Always the same, blue shawl, smell of roses, disappears near the old Mission Road." Frank felt the hair on his neck rise. "You're kidding." "No, sir. Locals say the Virgin herself's been appearing there since a storm washed out the chapel years ago." He went silent, staring into his coffee. Later that day, his dispatcher called. "Frank, you still in Arizona?" "Yeah, why?" "There's been a mix-up. That produce load you dropped last week? Turns out the buyer paid double by mistake. They told us to forward it to you. It's your lucky day." Frank laughed. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. Check your account." He did. The deposit was there, exactly enough to pay off his medical bills. That night, as the desert turned gold, Frank parked by a small roadside shrine he hadn't noticed before. A statue of Mary stood there, her robe the same shade of blue. People had left candles, photos, and little notes. He stepped out, lily in hand. He didn't know what to say. He just stood there, hat in hand, the wind whistling through the sagebrush. Finally, he whispered, "Thanks for the ride." And for the first time since Ruth's funeral, he felt peace. Months rolled by like mile markers. Frank kept driving, same routes, same freight, same desert sunsets, but something inside him had shifted. The loneliness that used to gnaw at his chest now felt gentler, like it had somewhere to rest. He kept the white lily pressed in a little plastic box on the dashboard, beside Ruth's rosary. It never wilted, never browned. Sometimes, when the light hit it just right, he swore he could smell roses again. He didn't tell many people. The waitress from the diner, her name was Linda, was one of the few who believed him. She'd leave him pie and coffee when he stopped by, and sometimes they'd talk about faith and foolishness until the neon lights went out. "Maybe it wasn't foolish," she'd said once. "Maybe she picked you because you were willing to stop." Frank smiled at that. He'd thought a lot about that night, replaying every word, every look. "You've been praying for something," she'd said. And she'd been right. He'd been praying to matter again. A year later, things started happening that folks couldn't explain. Frank had pulled over on a cold December night to help a young couple stranded on the shoulder. Their car had died, and they had a baby in the back seat, bundled in a pink blanket. The man was panicking. The woman was crying. Frank gave them water, then looked under the hood. Alternator shot. He offered them a lift to the next town. "Sir," the man said, "you don't even know us." Frank smiled. "Someone once gave me a ride when I needed it. Seems fair to pass it on." They climbed in, and the baby started fussing. The young mother hummed softly, a lullaby. Frank felt his throat tighten. It was the same tune Ruth used to hum. Halfway down the road, the man spoke. "You're Frank Lawson, right? The trucker who helped after the flash flood last summer." Frank blinked. "Yeah, how'd you know?" The man grinned. "My brother's in the sheriff's department. Said you pulled 2 kids from a car right before it went under. He said you were like an angel." Frank shook his head. "Angel? No. Just a man with a toe chain and a beat-up heart. The woman turned to him, smiling softly. That's exactly what an angel would say. He chuckled, embarrassed. But when he looked ahead, for just a second, he thought he saw a flicker of blue light reflected in the windshield, like someone sitting beside him again. By spring, word about the truck driver with the lily started spreading. People at truck stops recognized him. "You're that guy who saw the Virgin, right?" they'd whisper. Some asked for blessings, others just wanted to shake his hand. He never claimed anything holy. He'd laugh and say, "I just gave a nice lady a ride." But strange things followed him. A waitress whose son was in a coma asked him to pray with her one night. He didn't know how, but he did. A week later, she called, her son woke up. A mechanic who fixed his rig after a storm said the bill had mysteriously disappeared from the system. A farmer whose load Frank hauled through a flood later sent him half the profit, saying the trucker had brought luck. Frank didn't take credit for any of it. He just kept driving, talking to Mary sometimes when the night got quiet. "You must be busy," he'd say aloud to the empty seat. "But if you're listening, thanks for keeping me on the road." He started carrying spare water jugs and blankets in his rig, just in case. More than once, he found stranded travelers and helped them out. It became second nature. Linda, the diner waitress, started tagging along sometimes. She said she felt safe with him. They'd ride for a few hundred miles, delivering produce and listening to old hymns. Once she asked, "Do you ever think she'll come back?" Frank smiled faintly. "If she does, I'll make sure the passenger seat's clean." Then came the summer of his last haul. He'd been feeling tired lately, bones aching, heart skipping beats. The doctor warned him to slow down, but he couldn't bring himself to retire. The road was his heartbeat. This trip was a long one, Idaho to Texas. A haul of church pews, of all things. He joked that it was holy cargo. The night before he reached El Paso, the desert storm hit. Rain like nails, lightning splitting the sky. His wipers barely kept up. Somewhere past the state line, he lost cell signal. The GPS went blank. He slowed the rig, squinting through the sheets of rain. Then, through the blur, he saw a figure by the roadside. Blue. He braked hard, tires hissing on wet asphalt. The figure stood still, head bowed, shawl soaked through, but glowing faintly, just like before. Frank stepped out, heart pounding. "Mary!" She looked up, and the same calm smile spread across her face. "It's been a while, Frank." He swallowed hard. "It has. I was starting to think you weren't real." "I'm as real as the love that drives you," she said softly. Lightning flashed, and for a moment, her eyes reflected the storm, gentle, endless. "You've done well," she continued. "You gave when you had little. You listened when others turned away. The miles you've driven weren't wasted." He tried to speak, but emotion choked him. "Why me?" "Because you stopped," she said again. "And because you believed." The rain softened. The air smelled of roses. She stepped closer and placed her hand over his chest. Warmth spread through him, gentle as sunlight. "Your journey's almost done," she whispered. "But there's one more stop before home." Then she was gone, just light fading into the night. Frank stood there for a long time, the storm clearing above him. He climbed back into the cab. On the seat, another lily waited, fresh, bright, unsoaked by the rain. He smiled through tears. "Guess I'll see you soon, Ruth," he murmured. They found him the next morning, parked neatly outside a small chapel near El Paso. Engine off. Hands folded over the steering wheel. Peaceful. Inside the cab, the two lilies sat on the dash beside the rosary. Neither wilted. Linda came to the funeral. So did the couple with the baby, the waitress whose son had recovered, the farmer, the mechanic, all people Frank had helped without question. They shared stories that didn't sound like coincidence anymore. One of the truckers said he'd seen a blue light hovering over the chapel that morning, just before dawn. Linda smiled through her tears. "He finally made it home," she whispered. And on quiet desert nights, when the wind hums low and the stars burn bright, some say a lone truck's headlights drift down Route 85. The driver never stops for gas, never calls for dispatch. just keeps rolling, steady and calm, carrying lilies, light, and a single passenger in blue.